Good afternoon. My name is Patrick James Lynch, and I have hemophilia, and I will be moderating the panel that is about to begin. And in fact, if I could ask if our four panelists would begin making their way up to the stage to take their seats, I'll just take a moment here to introduce the program and let everybody who's here kind of settle in. And I'll say, too, if you are here and planning to stay for this 45-ish minute panel and Q&A, feel free to make your way up toward the front of the stage. I have sniffed everyone. Nobody smells too bad, I promise. I'm working on my stand-up material. It's a work in progress. Thank you. Oh, I have some fans already. That's good. Maybe San Francisco is the place I need to be. What's the deal? So Powering Through is an ongoing series of panel conversations that my organization, Believe Limited, produces and is sponsored by NCHS, which is a specialty pharmacy that serves people with bleeding disorders. They're also one of the healing partners of both last night's Light in the Grove event and today's event. So we thank them for that. We are filming this conversation so that people from anywhere, but in particular the hemophilia and greater bleeding disorders community who weren't able to be here have an opportunity to see some video, hear the stories, hear from these leaders on why today is so significant. And that video will be made available overnight. We got some people working overtime today, and we'll be on poweringthrough.org tomorrow morning. So if you see this conversation, hear this conversation, and think it's something worth sharing with other people in our community or in your community, tomorrow morning on poweringthrough.org, you will find that video available. These four individuals, is everybody's mics working? Everybody's mics seem to be working? Yep. Excellent. So,
Hello.
Once again, they've all been up here today at some point, but just to go down the line, we have Carl Weixler from the Committee of 10,000, Kimberly Haugstad from the Hemophilia Federation of America, Val Bias from the National Hemophilia Foundation, and John Cunningham, the Executive Director here at the Grove. I have a handful of questions that I expect will take us to about a 20, 25-minute mark, and then I'm going to open it up for anyone here who'd like to ask questions of these four individuals. As it's been said more than once, it's not often that all three national organizations are working together on a program of some kind, so this is a rare opportunity for the hemophilia community, and for those of us here who are part of it, I want you to have an opportunity to have some questions answered as well. So my first question, and keeping in mind that today is largely about reflection, healing, and commemorating, I'd like to ask each of you to respond either from your personal point of view or on behalf of the organization you represent. Quite simply, what is the significance of today for the hemophilia community? We'll start with Carl and make our way down the line.
Well, thank you, Patrick, and thank you to everybody. This is, like he said, a historic event to have the three of us on stage, and it's kind of significant of what today means is that there is healing that we all need and want, and having some recognition to the story and the Holocaust that has befallen the hemophilia and bleeding disorders community with HIV and with HCV. And it is very important to me and to the Committee of 10,000 to be a part of this because the Committee of 10,000 and a lot of HIV/AIDS groups in the early years were very much screaming that HIV was bloodborne because of what was happening in the hemophilia and bleeding disorders community. So being here today on World AIDS Day to have the recognition and the hemophilia community being recognized as the unsung heroes really touches my heart personally because in a lot of ways we were the unsung heroes. We were the ones that were dying in silence. And we have extremely high numbers percentage-wise of those who have lived with and unfortunately succumbed to HIV and HCV.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today, Patrick. Today, and I'll speak personally first. I've thought about this a lot, and every year on World AIDS Day, I have this thing that rings through my head and that I think about in the month of December, and it's a reflection and a thought about the what ifs. So for me, having a son with severe hemophilia today, I oftentimes on World AIDS Day think about over the next coming weeks some interesting things that are happening, like Ryan's birthday that's coming up in a couple of weeks. Ryan and I actually share a birthday week and a birthday year, and oftentimes for me, on this day and on my birthday, since my son was born, I think about the what ifs. What if he'd been born a generation ahead? In my generation, he would have been born in a small rural community in the Midwest, living with the pain of ongoing joint bleeds on a regular basis, and undoubtedly would have succumbed to HIV and probably hepatitis. My parents were very active in treatment, and I'm sure that he would have had clotting factor. He would have lived a life similar to Ryan's, maybe without the fame, but certainly the experience. And so I think about that every year, and I am just absolutely so honored to be able to have today with Jeannie. And so thank you. Thank you. From a professional and organizational standpoint, at HFA, we vowed never to forget from our history standpoint. And I think it's really important. This has been a tough year for us in the community. We've lost a lot of folks, some young folks and some folks who played a part in the fight in the 90s. And I think on this film, I'd really like to especially mention Ella Sulzer, who passed away this past year, and John Reed, a member of our board, who just passed a few weeks ago. And we'll never forget these men and so many others. So it's just a beautiful experience to be here today, and I thank you.
Personally, San Francisco's home to me, and to be here this time and have my wife's name enshrined in the circle of friends brings some closure in my life. I've been doing this work a long time, and it is really very moving. One of the things about the job I do at NHF that I try to separate from who I am as a person with hemophilia is I don't pretend and I don't get to be a patient very often because I'm doing this C.E.O. thing. And this weekend is a real significant where I get to be a member of the community and remember my loss and the friends that I have lost. Ellis being one of those people and John Reed being one of those people. It's been a heavy loss year for many of us. I don't see the separation in the three organizations the way other people do. My oldest and fondest memory of Carl was when we were in St. Louis at the first MAN meeting. And Kimberly I've known since I had my own consulting business and would invite her as a regular speaker. I don't really chop up the community that way. People have differences and people have different points of view, but we're all in this together. And sometimes we're gonna agree and sometimes we're gonna disagree. What I find fascinating about hemophilia and the organizations that we represent is that over the years, we have been what I like to refer to as uber organized, very passionate, very deliberate, and we keep getting up. I used to have this discussion with members of Congress all the time about cost of hemophilia, access to care, and I would always try to explain to them, it doesn't really matter what you do, we're still gonna bleed. So you can either help or you can pay, which is kind of your choice. And I never really gave them much of a choice in terms of stepping up for this community. So as an organization, we'll continue to organize. It's been a great opportunity to work with us, and I hope this brings some peace and closure to everybody, because we have some trials and tribulations ahead of us in the next 4 to 6 years or so. I told this to a member of Congress once too. I said, at heart, I'm an advocate, okay? So what an advocate needs is a target. And on November 8th, I got a target. That works for me. So it's a real motivation. It's going to be a hard struggle. We're going to win because that's what's supposed to happen. We're right. They're wrong. We're going to win. So,
John, from your perspective, the significance of today.
As a gay man, and when I first launched into this about 1.5 years ago, and it became clear to me that there was a lot of unresolved resentment on all sides of the equation. 30 years ago, when AIDS began to impact the hemophilia community, and there was a lack of any government response because of stigma towards the gay community, I believe it's understandable that there was probably a degree of resentment that if it weren't for you, we would get help. And there's probably some truth in that. But as Jeannie has continued to teach me, at the end of the day, we're all in the same lifeboat. And we either continue to use those oars and move forward together and bail it out when we have to bail it out, but get up and continue to fight. And we all fought in different ways and fought in our own struggles independent of each other. But as going to the organizational side, this organization has the responsibility to represent all segments of the American community that were impacted by HIV and AIDS, whether that's gay men, hemophiliacs, IV drug users, sex workers, whomever, with no judgment. And so as we embarked on this earlier this year, it's been just one of the most rewarding processes that I've ever had the privilege to be involved in, to know and to get to learn from this community and to see the courage and the strength, but then also to see the healing that has become part of this project and availed itself to mothers who had closed the chapter 20 plus years ago. And at that time, there was the struggle within the hemophilia community, that when you had a son that died of AIDS, you no longer had a hemophiliac son. And you didn't necessarily have anywhere to turn then, because those that were still struggling to try to keep their own sons or husbands or brothers alive, you weren't part of that anymore. And for better or for worse, they didn't find their way here. But this project this year has begun to open those doors. And I so look forward to continuing to work with the community as we go forward in 2017 and realize the memorial feature here in San Francisco and work together to do whatever we need to do to continue that healing. Because as I've come to learn as well, my healing is directly correlated to your healing. I cannot fully heal from this disease if my brothers and my sisters don't heal as well.
Very well said. You brought up something at the beginning of your answer that is kind of a perfect segue to a question that I want to start with Carl on, which is that there may be people in the hemophilia community then, now, who believe that if the gay community wasn't so affected, that stigma for treatment, or that stigma that perhaps prevented treatment for coming sooner, wouldn't have existed. And whether it's for lingering resentment toward the gay community specifically, or a sense of needing a memorial or some kind of remembrance that existed outside of the Grove, Carl, we talked about this a little bit. There are members of our community who are not necessarily enthusiastic or who are hesitant about the Grove's memorializing of the hemophilia community. So I'll start this with Carl, but it's an open question. How do we navigate the feelings of these community members and address their positions?
Well, I think it's a very complicated, complex situation, and it's basically comes down to the person's perspective and where they are in dealing with their infection. I personally have no problems with the gay community because, quite honestly, the Committee of 10,000 and the gay community were ones beating the drum very loudly in the early years to make sure that the CDC listened, that with the way our product was made, it was from pooled plasma, and there was, quite a few donors that were in that same pool. So I think in retrospect to the Grove as a memorial and having a separate memorial, say on the East Coast or somewhere else, there is some of the community that's going to always be polarized either to the far side of the pendulum in either way. But there are people that really appreciate that we have the Grove and that the memorial that is coming and being honored today as the unsung heroes. But I believe that there is a segment of the community that did not receive HIV, that only contracted HCV or hepatitis C virus. That being said, not everyone in the hemophilia community had AIDS. And the culpability of how we were intentionally infected and that it was a medically induced Holocaust, there is a segment of the population that doesn't want to be forgotten that they didn't have AIDS, and that our story is so unique that it needs to be told more than once. So the Committee of 10,000 has been working very long and hard on having a memorial. We are very, very pleased to be a part of today and pleased to have the memorial here in the National AIDS Grove. But we do believe that we need a separate telling of the story.
We've had a lot of emphasis on the power of story, so you make a good point in there that to have the story told and captured in a permanent way in more than one location doesn't necessarily hurt anything. It's an important story, and the more opportunities to tell it, the more effective it will be. I'm curious from Kimberly or Val's perspective, any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Carl had to say. I think what we believe at HFA is everyone does get a voice, and it may be in favor of being here, it may be in favor of something else, but everyone has the right to be heard. So we actually conducted at HFA a survey back this August, and over the course of about 3.5 weeks, we had a response of over 500 individuals in the community. And our intention was really just to ask, what do you want? I mean, this isn't HFA, it isn't, whoever. This is really about the community and what do we want and what do people need. And so we did this and got a great response. The majority of people did indicate that the Grove was what they wanted, was okay. But there were a significant number, upwards of maybe 40% of people who did also feel that something else was missing. And I think Carl described that inherent, that medical disaster, the intentional nature shouldn't be forgotten. And you make a great point, being somewhere else or multiple else's makes so much possible sense to really make sure that this is never forgotten. So we're working with the Committee of 10,000 and hopefully the National Hemophilia Foundation to continue to look both to support this effort and to have an additional effort. So our story is heard and not forgotten. Thank you.
I think you have to meet people where they're at, okay? And if so, first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to talk as a guy who got my HIV in the Bay Area in the 80s, and the gay community saved my life. That's where I got my information. That's where, before there was any medication, how I learned to survive with my disease. I wasn't on a cocktail until the mid to late 90s because of what I learned from working with the AIDS community and what was out there and what was available and how you had to change your health habits and how you had to stay alive until there was a drug that you could be treated with. So I see great significance in this monument being here and recognizing people with hemophilia. That being said, you have to meet people where they're at. And if there are people in our community who aren't going to be satisfied with that, then we should build another memorial on the East Coast. And to that end, what I've offered to do for the Committee of 10,000 and HFA is, if we're going to raise money to finish this memorial, let's just raise enough money to build that memorial at the same time. What's important about what we're doing here is we're trying to bring closure to a segment of history in our lives. We're not gonna forget this story, but we do need to bring some closure to it because this division causes pain. And it may be a personal pain, but as organizations responsible for all people with bleeding disorders, that pain could be destructive. HIV is not killing people with bleeding disorders. One could make the argument that the population at risk in the bleeding disorder community are women with von Willebrand's disease, who are carriers, who don't get the same level of care. One could make the argument about children who are exposed to inhibitors, and that's a high percentage in our community. And I just think we need to bring some resolution to this so we can focus on that and maintain the memory of what we went through here.
That actually gives me a great transition to the next question that I have to start with Kimberly, which is, and this has been touched upon multiple times today, that the election has brought us to an interesting crossroads. The Affordable Care Act is threatened. The ongoing struggle for women with bleeding disorders to receive adequate treatment feels like it just got significantly harder. So given all this, and given what we learned from the blood contamination crisis and from the AIDS epidemic with regard to advocacy and the importance of working as a unified community toward meaningful policy-level action, what steps can we take to ensure, as we've talked about fighting and keeping up the fight, but what does that actually mean and look like from your perspective?
And I get the fun question. Okay. Yeah. Ooh. So I think you actually use the word, and it's the word unity. And I think it's really important. There have been a lot of little bits and pieces of conversation today and in the previous weeks about us working together as national organizations. And I think there's a lot that happens behind the scenes that people don't know. We do work together. The policy teams at HFA and NHF meet on a regular basis and talk about issues that are happening. We work with our state organizations together, oftentimes presenting together in order to help really grow and build our advocacy, education, and our networks. And we work with the Committee of 10,000 at HFA all the time. Can't tell you how many phone calls I have with your board. So I think the unity there is some of that happening. Could we do more? I challenge absolutely. Absolutely. And could we do more? Patrick, I'll challenge you. Maybe we need to have some of these meetings to talk about some of the policy issues that are out there. Because when you talk about what do we do in this big picture of coming together, that grassroots is really, I think, what we learned in the 90s, the power of how important that is. And what is it, Margaret Mead talks about, the power of a small group of people. And we live that and really prove its truth. So coming together as that unified community and having more conversation. I think from an individual standpoint, this is a very kind of a helpless time right now. Everybody feels so insecure and so unsettled and so, oh my gosh, what we expected to happen didn't. And that's just a very powerless feeling, and we need to take some of that control back. And so those baby steps that we can be taking are just the fundamentals. Go back to basics. every single member of our community, whether you be a student, underage, or a retired person, can know who their legislators are. They can start to meet their legislators. They can start to understand the bits and pieces of the various issues. Just pick one tiny piece, and learn a lot. Engage, have sessions like this, please, Patrick, talking about issues, and we need to work together. There was the gentleman that received the Youth Award today that was talking about us working together as a community and just the idea of the apathy. We can't have apathy. We just really all need to stand up and get together. So I think all of us as national organizations will be working very hard to encourage all of our individuals to get engaged.
Anyone else care to chime in on that topic?
I would like to say that I think one of the first things we need to do is remember our history. And it's a very interesting history, but one of the things that the hemophilia community had done was to unite with the Ricky Ray Law. And for those that don't know, the Ricky Ray Law was to give compassionate care to people with hemophilia and bleeding disorders that had received HIV from the contaminated blood by the FDA letting us down and letting it to continue. So I think the Ricky Ray Law was actually enacted, brought before Congress, passed both House and Senate, signed into law, the hard part funded, and then sunset all in 8 years. And I was told by many people that they didn't know of any other community that had done something like that in such a short amount of time, which means that we need to remember our history, that united, it's like on the Kentucky flag, I very much believe it. It says, united we stand, divided we fall. And I believe that the hemophilia community and bleeding disorders has shown to be not only very resilient, but very powerful in their ability to speak to legislators. And quite honestly, my personal opinion, I think we were in trouble no matter who got elected.
Great. John.
I would echo that. I also believe that we're a lot stronger when we're together. During much of the fighting with HIV and AIDS, we were all fighting our own battles for our own communities, and that's understandable. I firmly believe that there is a lot at risk right now, and I'm not going to, fall into a place of complacency that, it's going to be okay, and just wait and see. Because all of us have fought too hard for too long to get so far along this road to have the potential for healthcare access and so many other rights that we can look at and take for granted today. So I think that together with a multi-pronged approach, holding our legislators accountable, whether it be through social media, whether it be in the streets, whether it be with legislators, whatever it is, it's a multi-pronged approach that gets the attention. And I think we can come together and do it together. And I think that's the best thing we can possibly do.
I think we're going to have some of those discussions ourselves, though. This election was more than about a particular politician winning. This election had some very harsh words for people of color. It was a referendum on women leadership in the United States in a very unkind and unfavorable way. It's going to impact gay rights. It's going to impact everyone's ability. I think we got to have some conversations with ourselves. When I talk to women around the bleeding disorders community, they're like, I don't have hemophilia. And they're, I get that. They don't have hemophilia. And they don't like the fact that the organizations that represent them review themselves as hemophilia organizations. That's a conversation we need to have as we organize against this new momentum. If you can't straighten out, if you can't clean up your own house, then it's hard for you to go knocking at somebody else's door. Carl's right. Ricky Ray was the classic grassroots campaign. We went door to door, member by member, and we got them to sign on to what was a horrific tragedy. What's scary about what we face now is it's not going to be a horrific tragedy. It's going to be a slow, bureaucratic, institutionalized war on life and access to care. It is not something you're going to be able to hang a poster up and throw darts at. It's going to be so subtle and so devious that the way it gets laid out and passed through policy and institutionalized throughout the administration, it's going to take a much more focused effort. So if there are divisions within our communities, that's the panel I'd like you to put together. Let's talk about that.
I'm getting a lot of homework today. Okay. Man, goodness. That's interesting. And you mentioned earlier as an advocate how having a target is useful, and how in what's coming, it doesn't seem like that target is necessarily as clear as we'd like it to be. There isn't going to necessarily be that galvanizing tragedy that brings us together. So we will have to be all communicating with one another to ensure that we find the spots that we want to unify behind and take action on in an organized way. Please.
I think there's another piece here. We keep talking about in and amongst ourselves, and it's not just amongst ourselves. I mean, there are diseases and disorders and people out there way beyond hemophilia, von Willebrand, other bleeding disorders that have the exact same scenario before them today. And so I think we need to really look at how we can unify just across all diseases and rare disorders and chronic conditions, and work really hard to partner and not be inclusive about, we've got hemophilia and von Willebrand or whatever, but really be more open.
It's an important time for allies and champions of all kinds, for sure. Val, this question is for you, and I have 2 questions left before, again, I encourage anyone here to take the opportunity to ask some questions. It's no secret that NHF faced a tremendous amount of scrutiny on the heels of the contamination crisis, and I'm not interested, nor do I think it's productive to relitigate the case, so to speak, but I do think it's reasonable and appropriate to ask how NHF has learned, grown, and changed as a result of the contamination crisis. And I welcome the other panelists to chime in on this as well, but Val, obviously this question is primarily for you.
It's funny, I have spent the majority of my career as a volunteer and now CEO at NHF, trying to improve the organization to, I was on the same side of that fence. I wasn't born at NHF. I was on the same side of that fence as an activist who was infected with HIV in the early 1980s and was as angry with the organization as anyone in our community, and had experienced loss, my own personal loss when losing my wife to HIV. So I get that, and my whole commitment to the organization has been based on 2 things. One is hearing all of those things that were upsetting to people, being in a position to be able to change them, to be able to make it a more open, transparent, responsive organization. And then the other perspective that I've always brought to the table that I thought was somewhat different. When AIDS hit our community, I was a camp counselor. So the first person I saw get sick were my little boys. And that forever changed my approach. I didn't try to fix NHF because it needed fixing as much as it was the largest organization and I thought provided potentially the most help for those little boys I had to face, and girls, every year at camp. That really was the emphasis for the work. And people ask me, you worked on a lot of things, you must be very proud of all the things. The thing I am most proud of is that I went to camp every year. And some of my kids are in this room, and they're grown up, and they're having kids of their own. And that was my most significant contribution to this community. Why I tried to fix NHF is because I felt it had the best opportunity if it was organized and transparent and doing all the things it was supposed to do to have the largest impact. And I think that's what the organization has learned. I know that's who the current board is. I know that no one who was there then is there now. So I know where their hearts are, and I know where their commitment is. And their commitment is to this larger group and to building bridges between other groups and staying ahead of the curve so that we can continue to provide the very best service and support we can to people.
Good answer. All right, last question from me is for you, John, and you've mentioned this today in a couple of different ways, and I'd like to think that I speak for Val, Kimberly, and Carl when I say that your engagement, and Jeannie for that matter, that your engagement with the hemophilia community to make today possible has been spectacular, that the level of care and nuance and understanding that you've pursued of this community is admirable. This place is important, and this place is lucky to have you. But I'd like to know why has, like you said, in 30 years, this has been one of the most meaningful initiatives and programs and coming togethers that you've been a part of. So just simply asked, why?
And I had this question before. We got these last week.
Giving away all my secrets now, John.
I waited till the end, and I pondered. I guess maybe it's the underdog, right? I'm a gay man. I'm part of a minority community. The hemophilia community itself is a very, very, very small segment of the national population. I was aware of the story superficially, and I felt to some degree probably embarrassed that I didn't know the depth of it until I started scratching the surface and spending time with Jeffrey and other people. And then I felt it was just my obligation. And then as I continued to dig in, I also saw that there was an opportunity. There was deep, unresolved healing to happen, not only within the hemophilia community, but to build the bridge between the hemophilia community and the gay community, to open up conversations like this, because that's where the healing happens. The healing doesn't even happen inside of the hemophilia community affected by AIDS. I mean, the real healing happens when the broader segments of populations come together and find common ground and commonality of where we've all walked together. As Val was saying, and we've all sort of expressed, the journey ahead over the next 4 years, we're all going to walk this together. And it's a matter of coming together. So, and I know professionally I needed to do it. It was the right thing to do. I mean, this memorial would not be doing its job if it did not effectively reach out. And I suspected in the early stages of this a year or so ago when we started talking, I think there were probably questions like, well, why? What are they doing? What do they want? Where are they coming from? And I can only speak from myself as I was coming from the center of my soul and the center of my heart, that it's the right thing to do. And I can say, as I said earlier, my healing is directly correlated to your healing. And I can say that over the last year and working in today as a culmination, I am a more healed individual living with AIDS because of what we've done together.
If I could echo that to a degree, that's appropriate. if I could echo that as a 30-year-old who has benefited from the medical developments that have come since the contamination crisis, who doesn't live with HIV, who doesn't live with hepatitis, who didn't lose a parent, who didn't lose a sibling. I've lost friends, not nearly in the way that these two gentlemen have, or yourself. The obligation you speak of, that resonates with me, because I belong to the same community as these people, as Jeannie and as Ryan, and as everybody who's affected by hemophilia and bleeding disorders. So the idea of there's an obligation, and if we at Believe, my organization, are committed to creating content and media that helps tell story and build community, it would be irresponsible to not help tell that story and be present and work. Because I get that question a little bit, why is that of particular interest to you? Why are you doing so much stuff with Jeannie and on HIV and AIDS? And it's because that's the shoulders of the community that I now get to stand up on. And without acknowledging that and supporting that and doing what I can to help the healing process and the story get told, I don't have a right to not do that if my goal is as I stated it is. So I resonate with that sense of obligation. And thank you for sharing so openly. Everybody, thank you for sharing so openly. I hope we have some questions for these fine people. The question is, why has it taken so long to recognize and honor the hemophilia community? Is that specifically for John and on behalf of the Grove, or anybody? Anybody who... Anyone have a perspective on that?
I don't know that I have the answer for you. I do know that the Committee of 10,000 has worked on it for quite a long time, for 20 years, actually 20 plus. I think it's because there's a certain amount of retraction and denial that is still a part of the psyche of living with HIV and HCV. I think that the times haven't been right because not all the players were in place, and there wasn't the willingness to move forward.
What can we as a community do to help with the educational burden that still lingers all these years later? Is that a fair capsule? So what can we do? I'll start by offering that I like to believe, and there's what we're doing today and capturing that and something that can be shared broadly, and there's other stuff that we have in the works that will help share the story with a broader and broader audience, and I'm hopeful that through story and through media we can continue to help educate. So just from my perspective, that's my commitment to that question or to that pursuit. Anyone else?
So I have a challenge. I like challenges. Why not? I think the real way to do it, I think the Grove is wonderful, and I think whatever monument we might build on the East Coast is wonderful, but it's how the story is told and remembered, and we need to think about getting this story told and put in the Smithsonian forever. And that way we will not lose the essence of the story. We will be able to tell in detail who was affected by AIDS as a whole. And to some extent, probably help our cause because we'll be able to tell them what they need to do to eradicate it, which would be a very special sort of revenge. So that would be my challenge.
If I may, as Jeannie conveyed today, I think it's a matter of being an activist, as Ryan was an activist in his own right, and it's a matter of demanding. And I don't know why it's taken so long. Aside from I think that there were some of the societal scenarios that happened, as I explained earlier. When a mother lost a son, she was no longer part of the hemophilia community. She didn't necessarily find her way in the AIDS community. So those that had lost did not necessarily find their way to a memorialization process. But I also think that it's a matter of us, standing up and demanding what we want and what we need. The seed was planted in my head, and I just picked it up and ran with it. And it's been, for me, it's been a glorious exercise, and it'll continue.
I have one challenge. Keep asking. make sure that we do this. Keep asking.
The question essentially is, why wasn't HIV and AIDS being discussed and the contamination crisis being discussed at camps?
I think there was a great deal of guilt about what was occurring in the community. I think for those of us who were leading camps, it was hard to sort out what your mother or father wanted me to tell you about HIV when I'm just your counselor at camp. Not allowed to do that. Today, you know, there are things I just can't talk to kids about at camp, other than, you know, be good, be on time, let's play. So I think HIV was a very difficult discussion. I think our remembrance ceremony recognized people that lost. We lost a lot of people to HIV, but we were continuing to lose people because they had a bleeding disorder. We didn't know Ryan White, but we recognized him every year at the memorial service and put a cup of water on the tree for him and anybody else that we knew who had passed that felt like we'd had some contact with. So not an easy story to tell to kids, not one that many parents wanted us to tell in detail to their kids. I can tell you that there was a lot of education done among the male counselors at camp. There was a lot of sex education about how to keep your partner safe. That was done at camp in the 80s. Dana can tell you when we had, as part of our supplies, rubbers and other large things so that we could show the boys what not to do. So there was a portion of that, but talking about the real loss of somebody who wasn't there last year, we didn't have permission to do that, and I think the community went through a lot of guilt about what was happening and who was at fault and all of that, and I can only say for myself, if we had to do it again, we might have done it differently, and I'm sorry you live with that pain.
I'm really glad you're here today. And I'm really glad that you asked the question. And the past can't be changed, but going forward it can. And I hope when this memorial is built, you come back and you spend some time there.
So I think that's exactly what I was wanting to say. So for those of you that did see some of the 17 oral history videos, I want to thank NHF for their support of that project. And those video oral histories are gifted to these organizations from the National AIDS Memorial and the work that we did this year. Because if we do not learn from our past, we're doomed to repeat it. We all know that there were many mistakes that happened. You know, there was all kinds of societal issues that came with this. And much of it being rooted in our nation's Protestant roots. You know, let's just get to the chase. And all of that influenced what people couldn't say and talk about and the like. But I think that it's a matter of us looking at that and realizing, as Val said, what would we do differently? Because there is going to be something else that's going to come. We know that. And it's a matter of us really looking inward and reflecting. You know, I was approached out here earlier today after the observance by a gentleman who said, I want to hold long-term survivors meetings in the circle of friends to talk to people that have lived through the PTSD of this. Because I can speak just specifically for somebody that lived in San Francisco and grew up in the Castro and lived in the Castro as an adult and watched 15,000 people in a 10-block area die within a 10 to 12-year period. That is a war zone. And those that survived walk out the front doors of their homes on a daily basis back into the streets where they saw the slaughter. And it's a matter of how do we support them. That's the next chapter of this book. That's what I believe this conversation has been rooted in. That it took too long, but the opening is here. And I commend Patrick, and I commend Believe, and I commend all of us for having this conversation. And I challenge all of you to go back home to your own communities, to your own families, and have these conversations, because it's, as in the early days, silence equals death.
I think we've already begun to see people, it's been mentioned a few times, there are parents who lost their children and then they were no longer a part of any community. We have seen some of them come back and part as a result of this effort. It's going to take time. It's going to take time. It's going to take continued conversations about today. It's going to take the sharing of content from today. It's going to take time. It's not something that can be fixed easily, but I would, as a former betting man, I would be willing to bet that everyone up on this stage is sensitive and aware of that and will look for any opportunity to bring those individuals back in if that's what they want. If that's what they want. I do want to just take a quick moment to acknowledge your comment. I felt like I jumped off of that very quickly. And it makes me think, just before we take one or two more questions, to the point you just made, John, about having those conversations, something I learned this year with the election was that I don't live in a country that's necessarily as progressive as I thought. At least there are still a lot of it that isn't. And I think any opportunity to have conversations about homophobia or sexism or racism, they are as important today as ever, even if I, as someone who lives on the coasts and is, an older millennial, thought we were kind of past a lot of that. We're not. And I will say both organizations have, because bleeding disorders don't discriminate, there are breakout sessions at the meetings that are held that acknowledge the unique challenges and needs that are facing different sub-communities. And I think that's something we just have to continue doing to make sure that we are acknowledging the people in our community who fit into those sub-communities and have their unique needs. And for the rest of us, the allies and champions, to continue calling things out as we see them, because you're right, and it's a good point. So thank you for raising it. One or two more questions, Michael, and then Jeffrey, you've gotten a lot of talk today, so you're going to ask the last question of the afternoon. That's so just to be clear, I didn't lose my brother to AIDS or hepatitis C, but I did as a result of complications related to hemophilia. And that's a great point, because that is beginning to answer the question, what would that other monument be? What is its purpose? Is it about the contamination crisis? Is it about hemophilia and the loss related to hemophilia? And if so, how broad is that? Because we still have 75% of the world that doesn't have access, half of which die before 10. So it's an interesting series of questions to begin asking so that we can understand what this other memorial could or would be. He's not here, and Jeffrey's requested if each person could kind of say a word about him.
You're absolutely right. Corey Dubin, if you haven't met him, he is a character unlike anybody else. Kind of a hippie leftover, and just a great intellectual mind and soul, and a great mentor. And Corey was, in the early days, a very vocal person for people with HIV and bleeding disorders. And he, in my words, not his, is taking a break, sabbatical, whatever. He was asked repeatedly to come, and I even begged, because I really wanted Corey Dubin to be here, because he is an excellent champion, and not afraid to speak his mind, and he's definitely not a wallflower. And it's kind of funny, one of our blood brothers, Dana Kuhn and Corey Dubin would be on Capitol Hill, and if you know Dana Kuhn, he's very proper, very fashionable, very well dressed, and they were nicknamed Freaky and Geeky. Squeaky. Was it Squeaky? Was it Geeky or Squeaky? Yes.
Debate about whether it was geeky or squeaky.
But we really wanted Corey to be here, and quite honestly, all three of us, I believe, really tried to encourage him to be a part.
Echo that 1,000,000%. I absolutely adore Corey, and he, I think in my perfect perfect vision of what today would have been, it would have been he standing next to Jeannie accepting this award. So Corey is an incredibly special man and has been really important. I think I'm here in the hemophilia community and in this role at HFA in part due to a little prodding and poking on behalf of Corey. So we absolutely, yes, absolutely. I'm so glad, Jeffrey, that you mentioned Corey because he should be mentioned today. Thank you.
It's funny, I don't think we're always viewed this way. Corey is one of my best friends and has been for, 30 years now. And he and I were sort of yin and yang with each other in the heat of the battle between NHF and COT. But Corey was always somebody I could talk to. And I like to think he thought of me in the same way. So we were friends. We knew very much what needed to be done to address what was happening to this community. We went at it in two different ways, but the purpose was the same. This memorial meant a lot to him, had a great deal of meaning for him. He was the first one to ever mention that we needed to have some legacy related to this, and I consider him one of my dearest friends. I remember at the height of one of our disagreements, and we had many over the years, but we never failed to support each other when the time came. Committee of 10,000 used to have a regular meeting at the National Hemophilia Foundation meeting in a room, and Corey would call me every year and say, "Val, they're not going to give me a room." And I said, "Yeah, Corey, I'll get you a room. Don't worry about it." And they would have the COT meeting and forum in the meeting. And then I remember my wife and I were at one of the world meetings, and Corey had done something, and he and I were feuding over something. And we took an afternoon, me and my wife took an afternoon to take helicopter ride around the thing. So we go to climb in the helicopter, and who's in the helicopter? Corey. So we ended up spending half the day together and half the night together, just hanging out and taking off our hats and being good friends. Best guy, one of the best guys I've ever met, and one of the reasons that we overcame, and why we got to pass Ricky Ray, and why we were able to come together as a community in a lot of ways. And I miss that that banter between each other and how we challenged each other to keep moving the dime forward. I thought that was great.
The struggle continues, and today helped, I think, go a long way toward making sure that we stay unified and clear on our mission as one larger bleeding disorders community, one larger AIDS community, and vulnerable communities going forward for better or for worse. Thank you all very much for agreeing to do this. I think this was a very meaningful conversation. I'm glad we'll be able to share it with the greater community. Thank you, John, for allowing this space.
And I would also like to, again, thank my partners. And if we could all please give it up for Patrick and his team and Believe for putting this on. Thank you, Patrick.
My pleasure. And likewise to NCHS for supporting this and continuing to support Powering Through.
To watch video from any of our previous Powering Through sessions, visit poweringthrough.org. Or to learn more about National Cornerstone Healthcare Services, NCHS, visit nchswecare.com.